Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Raw Podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is James Copley, joined as ever by my colleague Phil Smith. You can find this podcast on all good podcast places and on Shots TV. The Sunderland Echo is obviously all across social media and our website online as well and in print. Phil, how you doing, mate?
Yeah, not bad. Tired, cold, disappointed, but other than that, all good.
Yeah, I think disappointment is the correct word for the mood around Sunderland at the moment. Things have regressed slightly on the pitch. Sunderland obviously losing 2-1 to Ipswich Town in the Championship on Saturday after taking the lead. Again, as you mentioned, Phil, a disappointing result. But I think to understand Sunderland fans' feelings fully at the moment, we probably have to take a look at the club as a whole and perhaps what's happened over the past couple of months. I think people are pretty despondent at the moment, despite Sunderland's relative decent league position. Obviously, still in seventh. Still a long way to play in the season, and still right up there. But it just feels like the mood has slipped back, and that's owing to a myriad of factors: the situation surrounding the Newcastle game, the ticket in the Black Cats bar, the commercial side of the club. All of that stuff, it all seems to have sort of been brought to bear in the past couple of weeks. And it's culminated with this loss at Ipswich Town, which in isolation perhaps isn't the worst result in the world, given how Ipswich Town have done this season, but it just feels like it's all sort of going backwards a little bit.
Yeah, I think obviously it's important that we maintain some element of perspective with it in terms of, and when I say that, I mean specifically the league form. Obviously, Sunderland is still, on the same number of points as Coventry in sixth. It's 7 points from 5 from Michael Beale, which isn't a brilliant return. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but it's not it's not a desperate return either, with a couple of tricky fixtures in that. But I think there's a couple of factors. I agree with you totally. It was something that I was thinking about on Saturday coming away from the game, that sort of feel-good factor, which I'm not saying it's always been there over the last 18 months. There's been some significant bumps in the road. I'm thinking of deadline day with no strikers, all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, there has been this feeling that the club's heading in the right direction, albeit with a few hiccups. And I think that's probably been mirrored in the football that we've seen. That it's felt very fearless, very vibrant. It doesn't matter who we're playing against. We'll give it a good go. And I think a combination of factors, like you said, definitely the off-field stuff, which is still very much, I think, lingering over the mood of the club, for the obvious reasons that really nothing has happened since the Newcastle game. I don't mean that in a critical way. I just mean that we have no great sense at the moment of what actually happened, why it happened, and what the club are going to do to remedy it. So that's still at the forefront of people's minds. And the football at the moment is just nowhere near as good. The team, Ipswich is a classic example. It wasn't a dismal performance. I thought the application from the players was pretty good. You could argue Ipswich's first goal was a bit fortunate in terms of the deflection that sort of falls into Caden Jackson's path. Someone had a big chance to go 2-1 up without Sheesh and maybe the winner. But the football is nowhere near the sort of free-flowing, fluid, incisive nature that we saw, not just towards the end of last season, but actually in patches at the start of the season. It strikes me that, particularly away from home, Michael Beale is looking to tighten the team up defensively. And I think that's quite high risk, because if you don't get the result, then given the level of football we saw last season, by that I mean the excitement of it, people are going to be really, really disappointed really quickly. Now, if you win the game as you did against Hull, when Sunderland didn't create a lot, weren't great, but kept a clean sheet and got a Jack Clark, fine individual strike, then you can get away with it. But Saturday was a great example of how, if you take a slightly more defensive approach, I think, and don't win, then you can open yourself up to a lot of criticism. So I do think there's a sense at the moment that the team is stagnating a little bit. The stats very much bear that out. We should say, obviously, that it's a relatively small sample size and also over a very, very busy festive period when we know performances can dip and players can be lethargic. But yeah, I would say, I think it's a bit early to say the team's regressing, but I would definitely say it's stagnated. And there are some really concerning elements, I think, at the moment that have to be addressed pretty quickly, because they don't feel like the form team, do they? They don't feel like the team with the momentum in that playoff push.
No, they don't. And for me, that little spark's gone as well. That that exciting Sunderland team. It just seems to be on the wane a little bit. There are, there is mitigation, as you say, Phil, in terms of it being a busy festive period. Sunderland's squad is still on the small side. It's still on the inexperienced side. Perhaps this dip was always going to happen, but I find it a little bit of a watch at the moment. Let's talk about Michael Beale, Phil, because he's been in the post now since the end of December. Is it too early, really, to judge him? Obviously, we're judging him on a relatively small sample size, as you mentioned. There's the Coventry game, the Hull game, the Rotherham game, the Preston game, obviously the Newcastle game as well, and now Ipswich Town. I'll just read through the results quickly. Obviously, lost 3-0 at home to Coventry in his first game. Won away to Hull City. Then there was the draw with Rotherham. 2-0 win against Preston. Then there was the 3-0 loss against Newcastle in the FA Cup, and then the 2-1 loss against Ipswich Town. He hasn't had much time on the training field, Phil, although he's had a bit more of late. I think it's always going to be tough for Michael Beale at Sunderland if they're not winning games playing well, just because of how he was presented to fans in the beginning, and they probably thought they were getting one thing, and sort of Michael Beale came a bit of left field, and he wasn't fancied really from the beginning. What do you make of his life, his start to life as Sunderland head coach?
I do think it's a little early to judge, and just as you say, I don't think he's had a huge amount of time to get his ideas across to the players. And I think from the matches that we've seen so far, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of, you could look at Saturday and say, strange decision not to pick Rusyn, strange decision to bring Barr off, and you sort of go, it's unusual, hard to fathom that. You have to set that against, for example, the Preston game, where he made a really good decision to play Pritchard in that slightly sort of right wing role and cut inside and did really, really well, picked up the gaps in Preston's back five. So I think we've seen some good stuff and we've seen some not so good stuff. And that's kind of what you expect probably over a fairly small sample of games. I think the two things I would say is, one is that, as I say, so far, the football has not been particularly good to watch. Now, there are some caveats to that, in that the schedule has obviously been really demanding. Not a lot of training time, not a lot of recovery time for the players. And I think some lethargy is to be expected. But the football has certainly not been as exciting or as free-flowing as we've seen at times in the last 18 months. And that's a big challenge for him. And the other challenge he's got, which is not even really his fault, and to the extent that I feel some sympathy for him, is that when you sack a popular manager who's performing pretty well, and you talk about sort of detail and high performance culture and all these kind of things, your supporters understandably expect some pretty immediate signs of improvement and some signs of that ability, whether it's coaching or tactical things in game. And we haven't seen a huge amount of that yet. And that's a big challenge he's got to overcome. He was already on the back foot because supporters were a bit underwhelmed by his appointment. And like I say, in some ways, the bar was set unbelievably high for him coming in, and it was always going to be very, very difficult for him to match that. So I still do think it's early days, but my sort of instinctive emotional reaction, if you like, so far is that I feel as if his priority at the moment is to try and tighten the team up defensively. And while I can understand why he's looking to do that, it's making for, at the moment, a worse product, I think. And it'll be interesting to see how that fares over the next few weeks when he's got a couple of home games, a couple of full weeks of preparation. Will we see the handbrake come off a little bit? It's going to be really interesting to see whether that's the case.
I find it interesting, Phil, that Michael Beale comes to Sunderland in his first press conferences and in a couple of press conferences after. He says that he's fully aligned with the vision and the structure of Sunderland, and I'm sure he is. But then during games, he starts to, as he says himself, look over his shoulder, and he's struggling to bring on players to affect the game. He made that comment after the Newcastle United game, which was absolutely fair. So this little slump that Sunderland are enduring at the moment, and these shortcomings in the squad building and the transfer strategy, they've always been there, and it's consecutive managers, whether it's been Alex Neil, Tony Mowbray, or even Mike Dodds, and now Michael Beale. It's worth noting, my point is, it's worth noting that Michael Beale can only really deal with the hand he's dealt as well. Whether you think Sunderland should be playing a little bit better, in my opinion, they probably should be at the moment. But it is worth noting that this squad is still very inexperienced, still lacking a striker, and it's lacking that sprinkle of Ahmad quality, that stardust that it did last season.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's absolutely true. a big part of what I would say as well is you kind of alluded to there with Bale, is that he needs a little bit of help as well, in exactly the same way that Tony Mowbray would have needed a bit of help in this window. As a striker is certainly one. I think it's fair to say on that front that, having sort of talked up Rooson ahead of the Newcastle game, and with Rooson getting his goal against Preston, it was then an odd decision not to pick him on Saturday.
I did.
I'm not saying it was the wrong decision, by the way. I actually like Job up front. I think he's got a lot that really works, and I can understand against a team who play three at the back, see a lot of the ball, are very strong. Job's athleticism and his tactical understanding, I think, makes him really good for that role. And there's maybe a separate debate over whether Job needs a rest at the moment, but I'd say that's a separate one. But my point being, I don't think it was like an unbelievable decision not to pick Rooson, but I thought it was a strange one given the way that he talked him up sort of a week before. But as I would stress as well, that he needs a little bit of help, and we would have said exactly the same if it was Tony Mowbray in charge. Up front and also in centre midfield, I think for me, like, the balance of the side just isn't right at the moment. And it's not about, sometimes it feels like when you say, going out and getting a midfielder, people think you mean like grizzled 32-year-old playing 700 games. For me, it's not about that. It's a tactical thing. It's about somebody who actually wants to play as a holding midfielder, who relishes, cutting out counter-attacks, who relishes just coming to the centre arse, taking the ball, moving it on. For me, Ekwa, I think from what we've seen of him so far, to me, he's just someone who you want to be playing further forward.
He's a bit more dynamic, a bit more box to box, a bit more energetic.
I think so. And let's be honest as well. Let's be fair. He's only 8 months into his career as a senior footballer, so he was always going to have sort of ebbs and flows in terms of his form. He was never going to just crack it. But I think tactically, I just think Sunderland needs someone who can help unlock Ekwa and I mean, Neil's been brilliant this season, but both of them I think are better further forward, and even Job. You can then, absolutely. I think if you have a proper holder midfielder, you can then play Job as a really sort of aggressive box-to-box midfielder as well. So, to me, that's a little bit of a no-brainer. But we kind of expected them to address that in the last 2 transfer windows after Corey Evans' injury, and they didn't, which suggests that Speakman and the recruitment team see it differently to what we do. So that's going to be really interesting in the next few weeks as well.
Are they seeing Jay Matete coming back in and playing that disciplined number 6 role in the championship? Because for me, and for what I saw of him at Plymouth last season on loan, he is not that type of player. And in fact,
think he's a dribbler.
In fact, wasn't starting games because Stephen Schumacher said he's so enthusiastic that when we need a level of control in the beginning, that we're not actually starting him, and he's coming on to affect the game later on. He's very energetic midfielder, possibly in the mould of what we've already got.
Yeah, I think Matete is an 8 as well. That's my opinion. I think he's another player who if you play him in holding midfield, he can do a job, but you're taking away the best aspect of his game, which is to get in people's faces, which is to carry. Matete is really good at carrying the ball 20, 30 yards, and then once he does that, you can release Clark out wide or Roberts. So I personally don't see Matete as the answer. Maybe the club do. And obviously they see him a lot more in training and have their sort of analysis and stuff. But for me, like I say, it's not necessarily about, you need another Corey Evans, a player with 400 career appearances. It's not about that. For me, as somebody who actually sees that as their role and is, has a level of, even if it's
do that.
Yeah, even if it's experience in terms of having done it coming up through the age groups, that's fine by me. Do you know what I mean? But just someone who relishes that role, I think that's really important in this window, because for me, as I say, like, Ekwa and Neil almost played quite defensive roles on Saturday in order to try and sort of frustrate Ipswich, and I can kind of understand why you would do that. But for me, they're just not the players to do it. So it almost feels as if Beale is taking away some of the team's strengths, and we're not really seeing a significant upside at the other end. I know you could argue that kept a clean sheet against Preston, kept a clean sheet against Hull, which away from home is no mean feat. So maybe I'm overreacting a little bit to the Ipswich game. But I just feel like we've lost some.
The whole game, they shouldn't have kept a clean sheet. Let's face it.
It could have gone either way. That's my feeling at the moment, is that in order to try and tighten things up, we're losing quite a bit in the final third. Admittedly, there were some issues there already, and actually, we're not seeing. It doesn't mean that we're now conceding significantly less chances to the opposition as a result. So I don't think the balance is quite there yet. And personally, I think a centre midfielder would be just as important as a striker. But, some people may disagree with that.
No, I think so. I agree. I think as well, if you have a different type of centre midfielder, it does open up for a little bit more tactical flexibility and fluidity as well, whether Sunderland could play, with a 3 in midfield for some games instead of this 4-2-3-1, which has worked really well and is really good to watch. But sometimes you do need a little bit of control in games. If you're watching on the telly, we're going to have a brief advertisement break, and then we're going to come back and talk about everybody's favourite topic, transfers. Right, Phil, it's been a bizarre transfer window. It's the 15th of January. Nothing's really happened. Nothing's really happening up and down the country other than Eric Dyer going to Bayern Munich. Carvalho signed for Hull. But other than that, I'm struggling, really. It seems very quiet, very flat. Obviously, we've been preoccupied by a Newcastle game on the 6th, all of that sort of stuff. It's strange. It's bizarre. We know Sunderland are targeting a striker. What type of striker are they going to be targeting? Will they be able to get one? Will it be loan? Will it be permanent? There's all of these sorts of questions, Phil.
Yeah, I think we have a fair idea of what they'd like to do. I think part of the reason why it's been a slow start is because probably what they're looking for. I mean, to be fair, if you look at the last 4 or 5 Sunderland windows, historically Sunderland tend to do quite a bit of business on deadline day. For whatever reason, not particularly good for us, but that's fine as long as they get it done. Well, I think the first thing to say is obviously the priority is a striker, but Beale has made pretty clear, and to be fair, I don't think anyone would disagree. It's pointless just bringing in another inexperienced young striker to just add to the pot, if you like, because you've already got 4. So you've actually already got a bit of a challenge in terms of managing game time and keeping play sharp and what have you. So Beale's made pretty clear that if the player's going to come in, it's someone where we're going to be pretty confident that they can come in and a week later be starting and improving the team. I think that demands a level of experience, just in football generally, but at this level, that limits your options massively. And it also means that those players that you want to sign, there's probably about 10 other Championship clubs who want to sign them. And I think speaking, I don't know exactly where the deal's at, but Kiefer Moore's a great example, right? So everybody knows that Kiefer Moore's potentially available this month, and half the Championship would like to sign Kiefer Moore. That puts Bournemouth in a pretty strong position. Is anyone going to stump up to pay for a permanent deal, which would be ideal for them? If not, who's going to put the best package forward in terms of wages? And also, of course, who can convince the player that he's going to get regular game time? Because his big thing is, he wants to be in the Wales side for those playoff games later this year and potentially for the Euros. So I think there's a reason why it's been very, very slow so far. I think a lot of teams are competing for a very, very small pool of players. And that means the selling club obviously has all the cards, if you like. And we're actually seeing that, for example, with Sunderland in terms of outgoing. So I think there are quite a few young players who Sunderland would potentially be willing to loan out, but they're not going to do that until they've got their own business sorted, particularly not with Robertson Dack injured and Huggins and Sirkin, because the depth isn't massive at the moment. So I think there are reasons why it's been a slow window so far. I think it probably tells us that Sunderland are slightly doing different business in this particular window and probably looking for a little bit more experience. I expect it to be loans. I don't see them changing their model in terms of signing players on permanence, who are at the other end of their career or more towards the other end of their career. So, yeah, I feel like it is going to be a relatively quiet window and maybe a bit of a tense one as well to see if someone will get what they need.
We've got about 6 minutes left, so we'll rush through another couple of topics. Kiefer Moore is probably the name on everybody's lips in terms of incomings, but outgoings, there's been a couple of rumours, Anthony Patterson linked with Liverpool and whatnot. Can't see that happening. But the other big transfer story that will likely rumble on is Jack Clarke. We know Sunderland are in a really strong position in terms of his contract, 2.5 years. So it would take a monster bid, really, to dislodge him from Sunderland in January. And if that did happen, which there's always a chance, it would be a tough sell to fans and to Michael Beale, because this team's over-reliance on Jack Clarke this season. It's obvious.
Yeah, I just can't see. Obviously, a big part of Sunderland's recruitment strategy, in inverted commas, is to have successes in the building, so that when you sell a player, you're not essentially held to ransom when you then go out and try and get their replacement. At the moment, there's nobody even close to coming to the level that what Jack Clarke brings to this team at the moment. So I just can't really see how Sunderland could make that decision, to be honest with you. I think it would be too big a loss. And I think, to be fair as well, we've got to put in perspective. I know there's a lot of noise around Clarke. And clearly, if a Premier League team, slaps 20 million quid on the table, it's going to be a very different conversation. But Clarke, didn't ask for a move in the summer. At this point, he has not knocked on anybody's door at Sunderland and asked for a move. He is happy, he is settled. His performances continue to speak for themselves in that regard. I think he's made it pretty clear that if someone meets the club's valuation from the Premier League, he would like to test himself at that level, and he'll go and have that conversation. But he's not pushing for a move either. Absolutely, there's no sense of that whatsoever at Sunderland. And so I think fans can take a little bit of reassurance from that. I do think Sunderland are in a very difficult position if they don't win promotion this year. I think given that Clark at that point will have 2 years on his deal, there's no sign of a new one. His value would be pretty much at its peak to Sunderland at that point. I think it would be very, very difficult to keep hold of him. But as of now, with the obvious caveat, as you rightly mentioned, it can change very, very quickly. I don't think there's a huge panic on Clark at the moment. Could look very silly in a few days' time, in 2 weeks' time, of course it could. But at the moment, like I say, the thing that makes me think that it's unlikely in this window is, as I said, there's been no suggestions whatsoever that the player is getting a bit angsty and looking at the exit door. And as long as that's the case, Sunderland are in a pretty strong position to resist, unless it is a transformative offer, which will, of course, make things very difficult.
Yeah, worth noting as well that Tottenham are due a slice of any fee that Clark is sold for. Just as an aside, Phil, it's a bit of a crazy thought, really, Clark signed for Sunderland initially in League One, and then they managed to sign him on a 4-year contract after promotion. It's quite impressive in a way, actually. I know we haven't given anybody much credit on this podcast, but that deal in particular, albeit a couple of years ago now, was a good one.
No, an outstanding deal. And the reality is that, it's not ideal that Tottenham have a significant sell-on and all of that, but
you're not getting them otherwise.
Clark wouldn't be here otherwise. And the Sunderland recruitment team do deserve a huge amount of credit, and similar with Patrick Roberts. It's easy to see the level that they're at now and think that it was like a really obvious thing to sign them. Any club in the Championship could have signed Jack Clark on loan. Tony Mobley was on record saying he rejected the chance to sign him at Blackburn because he thought he totally lost his way. It was a really clever, educated gamble by Sunderland to think that in their environment and with game time, they could get him back up to the level he'd shown at the early stage of his career. There was nothing inevitable about it. So, I think, I agree with you. Maybe sort of belatedly, we can give some real praise to that. And Roberts was the same. Roberts' career was at the crossroads. There was nothing inevitable about the level he's reached either. So, a lot of credit's due for that. And when Clark eventually goes, it'll be frustrating for sure. But the club will be in a fairly strong position as a result of it, because like with Ross Stewart, they're going to be banking a huge profit.
Yeah, brilliant player. Funny to think that he played left wing back as well a lot of the time when he first came to the club. He's developed somewhat since there. Just quickly, Phil, on a couple of other outgoings, potentially. The two I was thinking off the top of my head, you may disagree with this, you may want to throw another name in there, would be perhaps Mason Burstow goes back to Chelsea if Sunderland can get a striker in. And then there's also the Jefferson Bennett question as well, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, Burstow, Beale said last week that they'd had the conversation with Chelsea and he stays here. Obviously Burstow played for Chelsea in the Premier League and the Carabao Cup earlier this season, which means that Chelsea don't have the option to send him on loan anywhere else, this window. So from that perspective, it's a case of, does Burstow come back here, but he's probably only going to play under 21s football, or do we try and sort of leave and fight for his place? As you mentioned, if Sunderland were to go out and get Kiefer Moore, a player with that stature, and then all of a sudden Rooson's probably second choice, and then Burstow is maybe a third choice, will Chelsea change their opinion? Possibly. But Beale made pretty clear he sees that as unlikely. And I agree with you. I think he's definitely a contender for a loan move. It's been discussed. I know the player's pretty open to it as well because he wants minutes. He's got his international career to think about. At the moment, Sunderland aren't prepared to sanction it because they just, with Roberts and Dak injured, they feel they might need that little bit of, something off the bench in stages of games. They're also something they're thinking long and hard about because Bennett, if he goes out on loan, has to play. But it also needs to be an environment where he continues, I think, to learn the language, because that's obviously understandably been one of the big barriers for him, as it has been with Rooson. And it also needs to be in a team that plays with a similar style so that he can integrate into what Sunderland actually want from him. So I think it's really tricky. And it would be the same with, for example, Louis Hamia if they decided to loan him out. It's one thing deciding to loan him out, but finding the right destination that will actually improve sort of the issues he's faced over the last 6 months, 12 months is a totally different question. So I think there'll be some loan departures, but I think that will be right at the end of the window because at the moment, to be fair, I don't think Sunderland have got the depth with the injuries they've got to sanction sort of 4 or 5 loans.
It's interesting with Hamir and Bennett, isn't it? Obviously, Bennett's been here a little bit longer, but these players haven't been in England or the Northeast very long. They're probably only just settling in the area that they're in now. So to then move them somewhere else in the country, albeit even if just for a short stint, is again a little bit disruptive because, players are human beings. They need a degree of stability as well, don't they?
Yeah, exactly that. And, while you might be tempted to look for a loan move abroad where they might find it easier in terms of the playing style and like you say, the environment, well, the question is, are you going to just have the same issues when they come back to Sunderland in the summer, Yeah. So, a really tricky one, that. And as you say, we primarily look at it from the football element, but actually the human element is more important in these scenarios. And you've got to find the place that, as you say, won't disrupt, that process of kind of like integration and settling that they're on at the moment. So, that's a really, really tricky one. And while I do think they're open to a loan, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't either for those reasons.
Absolutely. Well, you can stay up to date with all of the latest transfer news over on the Sunderland Echo website. We're all over socials as well. This podcast goes out live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Also available after the event on Shots TV and all good podcast platforms. Thank you once again, Phil, for joining me, and thank you for listening to the Raw podcast.